Welcome to the first of our In Conversation films with a series of leaders and actors across the education sector. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Nick Juba today, and I'm going to invite Nick in a moment to introduce himself and GB Met College. But for those of you who don't know, I should say my name is Sinéad McBrearty. I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support, which is the charity for mental health and well-being for everybody working in education. We've been around since 1877, supporting everyone who works in education. And we do that working directly with individuals in ways that I'll speak about a little bit later. But we also do it by working directly with schools, colleges, and universities to support them with their well-being offer for staff. And we undertake health research about the health of the education workforce and use that to advocate for healthier workplaces. So that's who I am and who we are. But far more excitingly is my new friend, Nick Juba. Nick, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself and the Met, please?
Thank you for that very kind introduction. As you say, my name's Nick Juba. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a large general further education college. We're called GB Met, or Greater Brighton Metropolitan College, and we work or we serve students and communities across the sort of Greater Brighton region. So for those of you who don't know that well, that obviously includes the city of Brighton, but it spans east and west as well, out towards Shoreham and Worthing, going north towards London, and going out towards Lewes and New Haven. I've been working at the college since September the 21st, 2015, not that I'm counting. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of who I am. I should say as well, sorry, for the purposes of this article, I'm also a non-executive director of our local mental health NHS trust. So that's the Sussex Partnership Foundation Trust. So I suppose I've got a sort of a personal interest and professional interest in health and well-being that's been really kind of it's been really helpful doing that in the NHS as well. So that's me, Sinead.
Fantastic, and that brings a brilliant range of perspectives actually from your day job as well as that non-executive role. Thank you, Nick. I guess the first thing I wanted to kick off with in the conversation is to get your take on what you think the major issues are affecting well-being and mental health in the further education workforce at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue for us. I think it's worth being clear about that up front. And it's one of the things that we talk about a lot in the college at all levels. I mean, staff talk about it, but managers right throughout the organisation see it as one of the kind of key elements of our work. Fundamentally, colleges are about people. You know, we've got nearly 1,200 staff and with a very large number of students as well. You know, that sense of how people feel about work and feel about their own well-being and mental health within it is a key part of what we do. And I think that, you know, there are a range of issues that come up in that are probably common across a range of sectors. And then I think there's some specific things at the moment that it might be worth highlighting as well. So there's a general sense in further education that we all work really hard. And that's not a aren't we hard done by, isn't it difficult for us sense, but it's a genuine sense, I think, of the complexity of the dual role for teaching staff in FE, in that they are expected or required in order to be successful for our students to be dual professionals. So they are people who both have that deep understanding of a professional or vocational context, which they combine with pedagogy and teaching and learning and understanding how students engage with that subject. So, you know, that's actually quite a lot to take on. And I think if we think about how that plays out for staff, there are all kinds of things that kind of impact. So workload is definitely an issue. It's something we talk about a lot in colleges, and you can define that in different ways, but whether that's about assessment and examinations or marking, or whether it's about the number of face-to-face hours that teaching staff are required to have, that kind of the way in which the amount of work that's required in whatever role you're in the organisation feels like that has a real impact on mental health and well-being and on anxiety and those kind of key elements within it. I also think, if I'm honest, that there is something that impacts on well-being, more than mental health, on the sort of status of colleges. You know, it's a really tricky one because we've got this critical role in our communities. We're working to serve the needs of a very large number of people, and yet FE is generally probably less understood because less people have experienced it directly. And I think that does have an impact on staff well-being and health, because we all want to feel proud about what we do, and we want to feel proud of our work. And I think there's something specific to FE about feeling a little bit sometimes, people often describe it as the Cinderella service. I think there is something in that. Just being really practical as well, there is clearly an impact for staff just on pay and terms and conditions. It's been increasingly difficult for colleges to maintain pay at a level that frankly we feel our staff deserve, and we've fallen further behind schools and universities, despite the fact that sort of 10 or 15 years ago actually FE was largely better paid. So I think those things combine to create a really quite challenging environment for staff, both teaching and support. And I suppose the other thing that I suppose reflect on generally is the amount that we're required to do with the level of funding that we get. So it's a well understood issue that essentially once you move into the age of 16, you basically get less money from government in order to support your learning. And yet learners in the 16 to 18 phase, we know it's a critical phase. And we've seen large reductions over the last 10 years in real terms, in terms of our funding for 16 to 18-year-olds, about 20% in real terms. And that goes down to about 45% reduction for adults. So that means that you've got this environment whereby our staff are having to do an awful lot, and yet we're not properly resourced to do it. And I think that creates an environment where we're always a little bit concerned. Apologies, we're in remote working, so my children have just closed the door as they brought me a drink. Wonderful children that they are. You know, that creates an environment where there's just this level of pressure and stress, Sinead, which I think comes from, you know, if I'm honest, a chronic under-resourcing of the sector. So we might talk about how those play out in different ways, but those are some of the particular issues. And then obviously I'm assuming we're going to want to talk about the particular issues that come from remote working and remote teaching, but perhaps we can pick those up in a moment.
Brilliant. That context is incredibly helpful, and there is a lot of conversation across the education sector about the pressure and the stress and the difficulties right now. But of course, the very important backdrop that you just painted so clearly is that it's already a system that is stretched to capacity, or perhaps beyond capacity. And so there is something for us all to think about if we're dealing with something really extraordinary as we are in these circumstances, many of us personally, as well as the demands of professional life, and we are going into it fairly stretched. That obviously raises some questions for all of us, I guess.
Yeah, it does. I think that's exactly right. And I suppose probably then just to kind of pick up a little bit on some of those areas. We're probably better placed, or maybe in better place than a number of institutions, in that we have invested both in terms of the technology, not in the way that we would love to have done, not with real generosity, but we have made investments in the technology that underpins remote working and remote teaching. And we've also invested through, frankly, the kind of brilliant staff who work in the college in the digital team to support our teaching staff and support staff to use some of that technology in a reasonably sophisticated way. So I felt that when we came to the point of lockdown and we moved to online teaching and learning and the delivery of our college core systems through working from home, we were probably at a reasonably good starting point. So we use a particular suite. We use the Google suite for classrooms and all of their other products. And I felt that our staff were already in a pretty good position. So they were already comfortable with using some of the technology. It was already actively being used with students. So that definitely made the transition a bit easier for us. We've just done a staff survey, actually. It's that took the pulse for both support staff and teaching staff. And we'll maybe talk a bit about some of the detail in a minute around some of the specific issues. But what's come back from that, and what's really interesting, is that whereas generally both teaching staff and support staff have been positive about their capacity to move to virtual or online teaching, there are a whole load of specific issues within that are causing real problems. So for some groups of staff, there are some real challenges, and they tend to run along a range of things. So the first is an obvious one around technology. My internet's not working, or I'm struggling with my computer, and those are relatively easy for us to resolve in most cases. The second is that people have got caring responsibilities. You know, you probably heard a moment ago, my kids came into my office then. People will be dealing with that in their own lives, and they might have parents or other caring responsibilities as well as children, and that makes balancing the requirements to deliver teaching and learning to a set timetable pretty difficult when you've got those things in there as well. And we also have lots of students with really complex needs. So that will be the case for probably any school anywhere in the country, but probably there is a higher proportion of students presenting more complex difficulties coming to FE than in other parts of the post-16 sector. So that means for staff, some of the things that are coming through and that are impacting on their mental health and their well-being is having to work with students who are finding it really difficult to adjust to lockdown, to adjust to remote teaching. And staff are feeling, you know, the pressure of that because they feel responsible and they want to provide the best experience. So I think one of the things that's really coming through is that sense of the impact that working with students remotely is having on teaching staff, and their sense of responsibility and the way in which they are engaging them with our pastoral support and our safeguarding on other teams. So there are some quite specific things coming out. Second other big theme, and then I'll stop, is about we're all social creatures. I mean, it's such an obvious thing to say, isn't it? But particularly those of us who work in teaching and learning, you know, we are deeply social creatures. And I think that whereas remote teaching, remote working provides, in the way this does, some of the things that you can do, you know, when you're face to face, it definitely doesn't do others. And I think, you know, there's a really strong sense that people are missing a physical touch of their colleagues, missing those wonderful conversations at the start of the day that happen, you know, naturally, and that are much more difficult to simulate in a virtual world. And I think what came through so clearly from our support staff was that sense of missing that, you know, those social interactions.
I think the education is such a profoundly social profession, I think more than most others really, and the sense that would be critical, I mean, this makes absolute sense. I had a conversation with somebody who was talking to me about missing colleagues, but what made me laugh was they said, I'm even missing the irritating colleagues, you know, the people I don't particularly get along with, but who are part and parcel of my day, and my day's not punctuated with the annoyance generated, you know, in that corner. And I just thought this speaks to so much, actually. But relationships are we've all anticipated the great technological revolution. And I think many of us have learned that there are a lot of things that we can do really efficiently and effectively remotely, but we seem unable to compensate for just that pure energy rush that we now realize we get from being in a room with colleagues and just seeing people and interacting with them.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can't replace that. It's absolutely clear, and as I say, I think our staff and our students as well will be feeling exactly that in the same way that everyone else is.
Yeah. From your perspective, Nick, do you think that there are particular groups of staff that are facing especially difficult challenges in this environment?
I think everyone, all of the staff at the college are facing some challenges. So I'm not sure that it's that some are facing more profound or more difficult areas than others. I've got complete sort of respect and admiration for every staff group, because I think they're all focusing, or they're experiencing, some common themes and some slightly different stuff. So first of all, you know, I've got to be honest, we've had to furlough some of our staff And we've, that's been an important part of maintaining the financial viability of the college. So, I think that's a good scheme. It allows us to tap into some funding for those staff who just can't work in the current environment. But I worry about those staff. I want them to know that we continue to care about them, and we continue, to think about them, and we can't wait to get them back in the college and see them again. So there's something about that. I think for our teaching staff, as I say, it's about that engagement for students. That's where the real difficulty is. So if I give you a couple of specific examples, we've got staff who are saying, so I've got 18 people in my group, and actually of those students, 14 or 15 of them are doing really well. I've got really kind of regular engagement with them. Communications are good, they're completing work, I feel confident that they're getting a reasonable level of student experience. But I've got 2 or 3 students that I'm really worried about, Nick. Engagement is patchy. I'm not sure that they're having a great experience. I don't know all of the things that are going on in their lives, but there will be some complexity there that will make it maybe difficult for them to engage. And I think it's those students that, for our teaching staff, where the concerns are. So for me, there's a range of particular issues that teaching staff are facing, but that's the one that I'm really worried about. And therefore, the other group of staff who I think have got a particular set of challenges at the moment in working remotely are our pastoral support staff. So we've invested really heavily in the number of staff we've got to support students, because we've got students with quite complex needs, and we've got a lot of students that access either additional learning support or pastoral support. So for those teams, delivering that support remotely must be presenting some real challenges, because it might be that some of those things are relatively low level anxiety with students that they're able to deal with more easily, but there'll also be some concerns which will progress right up to safeguarding issues and concerns. And for those, I think how we respond to those, that sense of responsibility that our pastoral support and safeguarding teams and our additional learning support teams have got, I think is different probably, and heightened in this time where we are very aware of views that we're hearing in the national press around the potential for issues around domestic violence and neglect, and other aspects of safeguarding concerns with our students. So I think they're facing a particular set of challenges, and I think that's it's worth recognising that and acknowledging that. Final group, they're much maligned and probably won't get a huge amount of support, but my managers, they're doing an unbelievable job. And I think, for leaders in colleges during this time, there's no manual for how you lead remotely. We didn't know what we were doing at the point at which lockdown started. And I just think they've done an incredible job in keeping communications open with their teams, in supporting and helping them when they've got issues, whether that's about mental health and wellbeing or anything else, technical teaching and learning. So again, I think they're facing different issues around how they, maintain interaction, how they keep people on track. But all of them have just been amazing. Of all those groups, there's just this deep sense of pride in how they've all responded despite those challenges to deliver for our students. And I think you'll hear that with anyone who you speak to, this real sense that people have stood up to this challenge, faced it head on, and really been creative and thoughtful and adaptable in how they've approached it. So hats off to all of them. They're amazing.
There's a theme for me in those groups when you're describing it. What comes through is it sounds like people are in real time working quite hard and creatively around boundary issues, because all of our templates and protocols for how we manage boundaries in the day-to-day running of a college are less relevant now. Or, I mean, it's not that they're irrelevant, but they don't serve all the circumstances being presented. And so I guess the other bit that's going on for your teams, whether they're dealing directly with students or whether they're supporting people in the pastoral role, or indeed whether they're line managing people with all the complexity that those lives bring, they will be having to negotiate and navigate these kind of nuanced, different set of boundary issues where work and education are far more in the domestic realm than we're used to.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, I couldn't agree more. And it's, I think, speaking from a personal level, we're sort of almost 7 weeks in now. I found the first few weeks extremely difficult. I found my own mental health and well-being was really affected. I found that sense that we've all, the corona coaster, as I've heard it referred to, that sense of, things being so changeable and so up and down, frankly. I think is absolutely there. And I think part of that is about coming to terms with the fact that you are stepping, for me, about 13 steps from my bedroom into my office and then back downstairs, and how you deal with that at a time when I have two primary school age children and my wife at home. It's a really interesting one. I think there are some positives about it. I've no doubt that there are some positives around the opportunity for more engagement with families, but there's no doubt those boundaries issues are really difficult to resolve, and we'll all be working through them in our own individual ways. And I think it would have taken time. It's definitely taken me time to do that. I think there's a further complexity though, Sinead, which comes from the boundaries that our teaching staff also need to set, not only with their domestic arrangements, but also with their students. Where is that boundary now when social or virtual learning is the approach rather than an ancillary approach? So where do you stop in terms of a student emailing you and asking you a particular question about their assignment, or when is an appropriate time to say, actually, no, we're not in a lesson at the moment, that needs to be done independently and I'll come back to it. And again, I think that's something that the teaching staff have approached in a really sophisticated way, but I do think it creates some further challenges around those boundaries. But I mean, how are you finding it? I mean, you're working from home as well. How's it going for you?
Well, as I say, it's been quite a time, and I mean, I would say I was knocked for six there the first week. I found myself going around in circles. I felt I took very seriously my responsibility for running the charity, for the individuals and their well-being in the staff team. Also recognizing we were going to have to work quite quickly to think through the financial security of the charity, to protect the work that we have in train and the people that we can support. So you kind of got all that stuff going on whilst my in-laws are significantly at risk, and my 9-year-old and my 7-year-old just want to be back in school. They love their parents, but they sort of, the first day of lockdown, my 9-year-old was really upset. He went, but it's 9 o'clock. We always do writing now. I don't know why you're sitting here chatting to me about, art and craft. I want to do writing, and then I want to do grammar, because that's what we do every day. And so the same as you, my partner is here working from home, and we have some great days, and then we have some car crash days. We just think, I don't actually know if I got anything done, but I got to the end of the day and we're all in one piece.
Yeah, no, I think it's my 9-year-old said to my wife, I don't want you to be my teacher, Mummy. You can't get much more profound than that in some ways. You totally understand where he's coming from. So I think it must be having, and I wonder as well, I'm sort of, it's great to have this kind of conversation and to talk about my immediate impressions, but I'm also really aware, Sinead, that I don't think we really understand what some of the impacts are going to be longer term on teaching staff and support staff, but everyone who works in education, how this period will have impacted on them. Because I think, whether it will be about personal grief that may have come from people who they knew who have died, let's be clear, as a result of coronavirus, or whether the changes in working have had, could have had really quite profound impact. I just don't think we understand that yet. So it feels to me at the moment as if we're trying to think through some of the immediate things, but I think that it will take some time, and when we come out the other side, before we really understand some of those issues and how they manifest in the longer term. That sort of feels to me at the moment.
I think that's a very wise perspective to hold. I think there is a lot of, we can see this more broadly. We see people responding to the issues and the state that we're in very particular ways. A lot of people, a lot of leaders, because we are so inclined as leaders, we like to get things done and to try and improve things quite quickly. And of course, we can tie ourselves up in a lot of activity, But you're right. I think it will take a long time for us collectively as a society to digest what's happened, to make sense of it, and the plethora of issues that individuals are facing, and the emotional impact on everything from, if you're a single parent in a one-bedroom flat trying to work and doing that over a sustained period of time, because nobody's expecting us to, in many jobs, nobody's expecting to go back anytime soon. And at the point where the schools go back, I guess we'll hear more about this over the weekend, but it's unlikely to be immediate. That's one level of issue. And then we have families who've, whatever the genetic component of coronavirus is, there are families who've been really profoundly affected with significant degrees of loss and bereavement, and communities that are economically ravaged, where all the jobs have gone in certain towns. So there are many levels, I think, at which we will make sense of this, but you're right. I think it will take a long time to get a view, and I anticipate a kind of scarring effect that surely must happen.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things I think that's incumbent on us, and I've been trying to say so I do a weekly webinar with all staff, and not everyone comes obviously, but with a Q&A and a chance to kind of try and get some engagement in a way that it's quite difficult in these emotions. And obviously I write to staff 3 or 4 times a week and do a vlog as well to try and again get some of that sort of that interaction there. But I've been trying to impress upon them that I have got realistic expectations about what can be achieved during this period. We are not going to deliver the same student experience that we would have done had we continued to operate in the college as usual. And I am very comfortable about that. And I want my staff, I want people who work at the college to feel that they're going to do the best for students during this difficult period, but not to add to the pressure, anxiety and stress that creating unrealistic expectations of what one can achieve. And I think that's probably at the core of some of the comments that we're getting through from our staff survey. Those staff who they just want to do such a good job and they're so committed to their students that they're probably being unrealistic about what can be achieved. And I'm trying to be as clear as possible, while at the same time ensure the college runs, that people aren't being too tough on themselves, and they're trying to think about what a sensible balance is and what a sensible approach to the work is, because it's not just doing what they did before. We've all had to work a bit differently.
I would certainly say I've never had as many conversations in such a short period of time with people where I've told them to just not try and work so hard, not to do so much, because you're right. I think people have this sense of duty and commitment to what they're there to do. And standing back from more of a leadership position, you can see that people cannot sustain that indefinitely. And, there will be risk of burnout and so on and so forth. So I applaud your lowering of expectations appropriately in the context of a global pandemic. That seems very reasonable to me, and I'd love to see that replicated more widely across the education sector. I suppose as we start to think about transitioning out of lockdown at whatever point that comes, and I recognise that for some people that's a very anxiety-inducing prospect. But without, being too concerned about when that is or ought to be, whenever the time does come, are there particular issues that you expect to kind of see patterns of things affecting staff, or is that, actually we just have to wait and see?
Well, there's a little bit of waiting and seeing, but I do think there's a couple of sort of observations maybe I've got at the moment, which, they're not going to cover all of it, but I think are the sort of things that we're starting to talk about. I mean, first of all is that, let's be clear, it is an anxious position. I've got so the questions that come through from my webinar on tomorrow, on Thursday, there's about 25% of them are from staff who are saying, so when the lockdown does indeed get lifted and we're starting to relax some of the social distancing measures, what does that mean for me, either if I'm in a high-risk group, or in terms of what you're thinking about doing, Nick, in terms of maintaining opportunities for us to stay safe, whether that's about the provision of PPE or whether it's about reorganising classrooms and spaces in a way that allows smaller groups to come together with less chance of transmission. So there is a high level of anxiety, I think, for staff. You know, one of the things that the government probably has done well is as we know, is implement quite a simple message around, you know, keep 2 meters apart. And I think that is really weighing on staff's minds. So I think it would be wrong for us to underestimate the kind of anxiety that staff might feel when they come back, and particularly for those in high risk groups, of which I've got quite a few staff. So that's my first thing. I think the second thing is that I definitely want to do something, I don't know what it looks like, to support that social re-engagement and reconnection. So I don't know, you know, it feels a bit glib, doesn't it, about having a sort of a summer barbecue, or a chance for people to come together and do some coffee mornings, or, you know, some resolutely social opportunities, rather than just, right, we're back, we've got students coming in 3 weeks' time. How your tutorials are looking? What you're thinking about the induction? I think we've got to create some opportunity for that to happen again, and I'm not quite sure what that looks like at the moment, but that's there. I also think one of the sort of things, one of the impacts, and quite a lot of the questions that I'm getting from staff at the moment are along the lines of, so are we going to go back to exactly as the way we did before? Because that doesn't feel quite right. But equally, we're, you know, teaching and learning is, at least, you know, for the last couple of thousand years, has been primarily located in face-to-face, you know, studios, workshops, classrooms. So we know that's important. So what does that look like in the future? And then, can I work from home more? Or what do you think if I want to do more remote delivery, and how would that work? So I think we've got, as schools and colleges and universities, to think really carefully about how we harness the good bits of this. Because let's be clear, there are some good bits. There are some things that I am no longer going to do, i.e. I am not going to spend hours and hours every week travelling between the 5 campuses of GB now. I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'll still want to go and see people, but I'm not going to do it in the way that I felt was essential before. I'm clear now that the technology will allow me to behave slightly differently. And yet, I still want that social interaction with my staff. So I think we've got to think really carefully around, what do our working practices look like in the future? How can we build remote working and face-to-face into that, and what does that mean for the way that we approach teaching and learning? And I think that's a really exciting conversation, but I can tell already that staff want to have it. They're starting to think about it, and so I think it's incumbent on us to come back with some ideas around that, so that we're not just either pretending that somehow we're going to go back to exactly the pre-lockdown, or that everything's changed and nothing will ever be the same again, because neither of those are true, are they? And we've got to do a bit of both. So I think for me, it's those are some of the things we're thinking about.
Brilliant. And in terms of the support that's available typically to anyone working in further education, is there kind of a consistent baseline of well-being and mental health support that's available, or is it really wholly variable by institution?
That's a really good question, and the honest answer is that I don't know. I couldn't tell you with any certainty exactly what it's like in all colleges up and down the country, but I can tell you that every principal CEO that I speak to is absolutely concerned with staff wellbeing and mental health. So there's no doubt that it will be a key part of their thinking about how they work in that institution, in every college up and down the country. Exactly how that manifests itself in terms of the specific services, I don't know. But if I give you a flavour of what we do, that might give a sense of the kind of things that are available. I mean, we've got, you know, a really good employee assistance programme where staff can access counselling, CBT, advice on financial matters, legal services, you know, all of those kind of areas, and so can their spouses. And that's a really well-used service. It's something it's a significant investment, but it is a really important part of the offer. And I think, in terms of helping individuals, that's a really key part of it. And I imagine most colleges do that. We've also got, as probably a lot of other colleges and schools, quite a sophisticated occupational health program. And that's about supporting, emotional and health, as well as physical, obviously. And then we've got a whole range of things that we do that are more about, providing information, advice and guidance. So we've got dedicated kind of pages and areas on our staff portal, on our intranet, and we've really expanded those as part of this remote working period, where we've got a lot more information around tips for working remotely and good practice, and how to respond to some of the technology challenges. So we've been trying to kind of boost the information that we provide, the kind of first line responses, so that staff can access some of those themselves. We've got a really sophisticated CPD program, because we've got such a large staff body with sort of 1,100-1,200 staff, and a lot of that is about techniques, approaches to supporting staff to work safely and to protect themselves and their mental health and well-being, as well as that of their students. So we've updated that as part of the response to COVID-19, and shared a kind of a revised CPD offer that staff can access remotely. So there's quite a bit in there as well. And then I suppose there's all the informal things that come from the networks that staff have got amongst themselves, frankly, and those sort of support. So those are probably some of the main things we have in the college, and I suspect that's probably reasonably standard.
Brilliant. I think the other bit I will flag to anyone listening from a college, or indeed from any education establishment, education support is also a resource to anyone working in the sector. And there are probably three things that are particularly important for people to know right now. One is that we have a helpline. And so for anyone who isn't covered by some other employee assistance provision through the college, you can 24/7 pick up the phone to 08000 562 561 and get through to a qualified and accredited counsellor for a free and confidential conversation. They can help you in the moment with any particular things that you're dealing with. I would also make people aware of our financial assistance programme. As a charity, we will and can and do make grants to people in hardship. We have been, over the past few weeks, making a lot of grants to support people to stay in their homes and to feed their families. Has been the primary thing we've been doing. So if there is anyone listening to this conversation who thinks that there's somebody they could point in that direction, then please do. And the last point I'd make is just we've been creating video resources for the education workforce to talk through issues like anxiety or grief. We've got some coming on bereavement. And the point of those is to put some small amounts of content on video. These are 10 or 15 minute clips for the most part, that provide some really specific guidance to people about things they can do if they're experiencing difficulty around these themes. But it also prompts, reflection, which is, I think, very helpful right now. I'm going to choke.
Don't do that. That's not good.
I obviously got, very emotional in that moment. My next question for you, Nick, and we're kind of the penultimate question, I guess, really, is from your perspective, what do you think are the most important things that leaders can do right now to support staff?
I think we've got quite a lot of listening to do. I think, I was really keen to just to survey staff and get a sense of where they were and to listen to what the real challenges are. And I think, it's quite tempting to say, oh, we know what staff are going to be feeling. We know how difficult this is going to be, and these are the issues that they're going to face. I think we've got to be a bit more sophisticated. I feel I have to be a bit more sophisticated and listen to staff. And I think I'm going to have to do that at several points, because as I've probably already said, I think, understanding the particular crisis at the moment and how it plays out is going to take time. So I'm going to want to be checking in regularly with teams to understand how their health and well-being has been affected over various points. So I just don't think we can underestimate how important that kind of evidence base is, listening to what people are saying and then, frankly, acting on it. So if I give you an idea what I mean by that, just a couple of practical examples. So we've got, in doing our survey and asking staff how they're feeling, for our teaching staff, we've got quite a large number who had some quite specific issues that they wanted to address around teaching and learning, around digital practice, around engaging students who they were struggling to engage with or to get engagement from. And so we've used our coaches. We've got these sort of learning coaches there, brilliant teachers who can provide some expert advice and guidance on those particular areas. So I think this week and next week we've got 50 different engagements from those coaching teams with individual staff to talk through the specific problems or challenges or issues that they're facing. And I think that's really important, because I hope that, as well as the sort of generic stuff that I do around saying, you know, we care, we're interested, we want to know what's going on, I think having that practical access to support is really, really important. Another thing which I've had to battle a bit, if I'm honest, within my own college, luckily I'm the boss, so in the end I kind of have made a bit of progress, is just to say that actually when people left 7 weeks ago, what they thought they might have needed in terms of kit, technology, seats, no, it sounds silly, but those things are not what they've realised they need now, and they're all, you know, we're all suffering bad backs or whatever it is. And you know, I've been really keen to ensure that where staff need to, they can get in and pick up those bits. And that's slightly terrifying, isn't it? Because, you know, I've got IT directors and others saying, "Oh, we'll never see it again," and you know, and I just think that just doesn't make any sense. I think we've got to help people. So there's some quite practical stuff, I think, just to try and make it as kind of as easy as possible for people to work in this difficult time.
Brilliant. There'll be a lot of people rubbing the small of their back in anticipation of a better chair in their future, I think, on hearing that, Nick. I suppose the last question I have for you is, I think there's been a lot in this conversation to reflect on and think about in terms of mental health and staff well-being. This may be too early, but are there any particular changes in terms of policy or practice? I know we talked about, you know, a shift to, it's not going to go back to the way it was, but nor is everything going to be different. But at a policy level, are there any particular shifts that you'd like to see coming out of this that maybe are informed by this experience?
Do you mean at a sort of a national level? Is that your? Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think it's a really obvious one, and apologies for it, but you know, I am heartened by the fact that, and this has come through very clearly through the mental health trust that I mentioned earlier. There's a sense with which we are talking about well-being and mental health in a really much more interesting way, a much more nuanced way, a much more open way, frankly. And, you know, that's been a long time coming, hasn't it? And we've seen improvements around the stigma that's associated with mental health. And I think the big learning here is that it's unavoidable now to think properly, to talk properly and openly about health and well-being, mental health and well-being, and that's the thing I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see that trajectory improve and increase, and I'd like that dialogue to get more sophisticated, and I'd like that to then inform the way in which we think about the culture of our organisations and how we work together on quite prosaic levels around coming in or working from home, and in much more fundamental levels around what our expectations are about what it's like to work in what I think are pretty stressful jobs in pretty stressful sectors. So I think, you know, that for me would be a big win if we get to that stage where that improved level of debate helps to impact on the culture of the organisation and the acceptance of some of the challenges that people face in this space.
I think you make a fantastic point there. I think well-being has over time become fairly depoliticized, really, in the sector, not just in the sector, but certainly in the education sector. And I think even the conversations we're still having about what's an appropriate sort of safety response now in terms of PPE or distance in educational establishments speaks to that. But if this, you know, if off the back of this crisis we start to swim upstream a little bit in policy making and review some of the beliefs that underpin our policies in the light of this learning, that could be very powerful.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, just looking at it at the system level, putting the college to one side for a little bit, if I think about the, you know, the place in which I live, if I think about Sussex as an area within which there's a health sort of a health system, I would like, I think there is a growing understanding within the kind of health and social care system that mental health is going to be, and the treatment of mental health is going to be increasingly important. We know that, you know, just if I think about staff in the trust where I'm a non-exec, are going to be coming out of this, some of them with PTSD. There is no doubt about it, and that staff in the NHS are going to experience some really difficult stuff. And I think if at a system level we can start to prioritise the treatment and recognition of mental health and well-being in a way that brings it more closely in line with physical health, I think that would be really, really important. And I see some positive signs in that. I'd be interested to know whether you do as well. But, you know, the conversations in the trust at the moment are very much that, you know, wow, there really is a recognition that the work that's going to happen after we come out of this in supporting those who have had challenges is going to be really, really important. So I think it's not just about the college, it's about that wider way in which the system, the public sector works in order to prioritise resources and activity in this space.
I think certainly, I think you're right. I think there has been a big shift. There remains a fairly strong rump, I think, of stoicism. You know, people should be able to just get on with this because I can. And I think I don't underestimate the power of that. But I think it has become much more normal to discuss properly and in a considered way mental health and well-being, and to recognize that this isn't, you know, it's not soft and fluffy and just a sort of nice to have. This is really fundamental to how we can move forward. So I think that wider recognition certainly is there. We have to probably continue working to make sure that at the key decision-making points that's widely shared. And continue to push for that. But I think there's good data and good evidence that comes out of this crisis actually to support that as well. And I guess the other thing that occurs just goes really back to the beginning of this conversation when you talked about status. And I think one of the things that must come out of this is an increased appreciation for what schools, colleges, universities, and all the people working in them do, the contribution that they make, and for the tremendous passion and creativity and time and space and skill and professionalism that educators bring to their work. And without that, without being able to bring that back into play in whatever the kind of post-COVID economy looks like, if we can't do that well, we will slow, I think, our national progress out of this. And I don't think that's controversial. I don't think there'd be very much disagreement with that. And I think that is a shift. I think that status thing will probably, you know, in that sense, might move more quickly.
Yeah, there'll be parents up and down the country reflecting on just how difficult it is to be a teacher, that's for sure.
Exactly. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. It's incredibly interesting to kind of get your perspective, and this is all real time for all this stuff. So it's great generosity on your part to share it. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. I just hope it's useful. As I say, I can only ever tell you my own personal impressions of what's happening in my own college, and you know, another person would probably tell you something different. But if it contributes to the debate, then it's been really, really lovely to speak to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, sir. And I'll just remind anyone listening that the Education Support Helpline is available on 08000 562 561. Thank you.